Imagine you are in your own home. The lights are off in most of the rooms. The streets outside are quiet. Every sound in the house is clear, every tick of the clock, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains when the night air pushes through the windows. You believe you are safe, because it is your space, your walls, your doors, and your locks. But safety inside a home is not always guaranteed. And on one weekend, a young man discovered this in a way he would never forget. His name was Daniel. He was 23 years old, a final-year student at a local university. He lived in a modest two-bedroom house that his parents had recently moved into. It was the kind of house you would pass by without much notice: light brown walls, a small porch, and a front yard with a single oak tree. Daniel was not a troubled young man. He was calm, quiet, and usually avoided unnecessary attention. He liked to read, he liked to write, and he often enjoyed staying indoors. But this weekend was different. For the first time, Daniel was about to experience living completely alone in that house. The house itself was not very large. When you entered through the front door, you immediately stepped into the living room. To the left was the kitchen, with a back door that led into the small yard. A narrow hallway stretched straight from the living room. On the right side of that hallway was Daniel's bedroom. Opposite his room was the guest room, and at the far end, there was a bathroom. The layout was simple, but it meant that anyone standing in the hallway could see almost every door at once. At night, when the lights were off, that hallway would look like a long tunnel, where only Daniel's bedroom light stood out. Beyond that, the rest of the house was swallowed in quiet darkness. Daniel always kept his bedroom neat. A desk pressed against the wall, a single bookshelf filled with old novels, and a bed by the window that faced the street. From his bed, he could see the lamppost outside. That faint light would always leak in through the curtains, making thin lines on his wall. That Friday evening, Daniel's parents had left town. They were attending a wedding in another city and planned to stay overnight. They trusted their son to take care of the house. It was nothing unusual. Daniel had the weekend to himself, no siblings, no visitors, no one else in the house. At first, he welcomed it. A quiet weekend to relax, watch movies, eat whatever he wanted, and not worry about anyone disturbing him. But as the hours stretched, Daniel would come to realize that quiet can be unsettling when it is the only sound you have. Earlier that same week, Daniel had heard about a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. Local news reported that thieves were targeting houses that looked empty at night. Windows left open, doors not properly locked, or curtains drawn back too wide were invitations for someone looking to get inside. Neighbors whispered about it during the day. Some said they saw strange cars parked near the blocks at night. Others claimed they heard footsteps in alleys but found no one there. Daniel's parents even joked about it before leaving, telling him to make sure he locked up properly, just in case. He had laughed along, but now, as the house stood still and quiet, the thought lingered. Think about this for a moment. Imagine yourself in Daniel's position, a young man in his 20s, alone in a quiet house, with news of intruders fresh in your mind. The night stretches ahead of you, the silence pressing harder with every hour. How comfortable would you be spending an entire weekend home alone? The first night passed quietly, but not without small details that caught Daniel's attention. Around midnight, as he lay in bed scrolling through his phone, the lamp on his desk flickered. Just once. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, but it was enough for him to glance up and stare at the bulb. He brushed it off. Old wiring, maybe. The house wasn't brand new, and the power lines in the area had always been unreliable. He set the thought aside and returned to his screen. But when it flickered again, just 5 minutes later, he noticed. He leaned over, tapping the base of the lamp. The light steadied. Silence followed, the type of silence where you suddenly become aware of your own breathing. He pushed it away. Later that night, the house began to speak in ways Daniel hadn't paid attention to before. A soft groan from the hallway floorboards. The distant click of the pipes in the kitchen wall. A sound that could have been the wind pressing against a loose shutter. He told himself houses do this. They settle, they creak, they move with the night air. He repeated this in his head, but even explanations don't change the way silence makes ordinary sounds sharper. Every small noise felt magnified, stretched out in the emptiness of the house. At one point, he froze. He had heard something from the guest room across the hall. It was faint, almost like a dragging sound, as if fabric had shifted on the floor. He waited, staring at his door. After a few seconds of stillness, he laughed quietly to himself. Probably the curtain brushing against the window. That was all. At 1:12 a.m., his phone buzzed. Not a notification, just a single vibration. He picked it up and saw nothing. No missed call, no message, no app alert. The screen lit up with the time, then went dark. He placed it back down. Seconds later, the phone made a faint static sound, like the crackle of a radio caught between stations. He lifted it again, staring at the blank screen. No music playing, no open apps. Just static, faint but clear. Then it stopped. Daniel set the phone down more carefully this time, turning it face down. He sat back, eyes drifting toward the window. The street outside was empty, the lamppost spilling its weak light across the pavement. He told himself it was nothing. Technology acts strange sometimes. The house grew heavier with each passing minute. The ticking of the clock in the living room reached his ears through the hallway. The sound of dripping from the kitchen faucet added a slow, uneven rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Drip, drip. Daniel lay on his bed listening to the two sounds competing, both steady, both refusing to stop. They became louder the more he listened. He pressed his pillow over his ears, but the ticking seemed to grow sharper inside his head. Then, another noise. This time from above. A faint shift, like a board in the attic pressing under weight. He sat up. His eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening hard. One creak. Then silence. Another creak, slower, stretched out. He swallowed. Attics are full of wood, wood expands, wood shifts. He repeated the thought again and again, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a third sound. None came. When he stepped out to use the bathroom, the hallway looked longer than usual. His room was bright compared to the shadows ahead. He flicked the switch near his door. The bulb overhead flickered once, then turned on fully. The light revealed everything was as it should be. The guest room door closed, the bathroom door cracked slightly open, the living room beyond the hallway quiet. Still, he felt something odd. The kind of oddness you can't point out, but you feel in the way your shoulders tense. He used the bathroom quickly, keeping the door half open, and then returned to his room. Before shutting the door, he glanced back down the hallway. The bulb gave another small flicker before he switched it off. The darkness seemed to fold over the house instantly. Back inside, he locked his door. He had never locked it before when his parents were home, but tonight he slid the small latch shut. It was a small action, almost unconscious. His eyes returned to the desk lamp. The light was steady, no flicker. He turned on his phone again. This time it was fine. No static, no sudden vibration. He opened a video, letting it play softly in the background, using the sound as company against the silence. His eyes grew heavy. Just before drifting off, he thought he heard something faint, a small scratching sound at the far end of the hallway. Almost like fingernails against wood. But he told himself not to check, not to get up. Whatever it was, it could wait until morning. At this point, Daniel had explanations for everything: the flickering light, the creaks in the ceiling, the strange noise on his phone. But you, watching this, must ask yourself, would you have brushed this off the way he did? Or would you have gotten up, taken your things, and left the house immediately? The house had fallen into that deep stillness that only arrives late at night, when the world outside feels asleep, and even the smallest sounds carry too far. He sat in the living room with the TV on low, trying to shake off the unease from earlier, the flickering lights, the faint creaks, the odd bursts of silence. But then, things began to change in ways that were harder to explain. It started with something so simple, he almost convinced himself he imagined it. He had placed his car keys on the small wooden table by the front door earlier that evening, a habit he never broke. But when he reached for them, they weren't there. He scanned the table carefully, then crouched to check the floor, thinking they must have fallen. Nothing. Minutes later, he found them sitting neatly on the kitchen counter. He had not gone into the kitchen since dinner. He tried to rationalize. Maybe he had carried them absent-mindedly. Maybe he had forgotten. But that didn't explain how they were placed so precisely, as though someone had lined them up for him to find. The next disturbance came not long after. The cupboard door in the hallway, the one that creaked whenever it was opened, now stood ajar. He was certain he had closed it earlier. Slowly, he pushed it shut, the hinges moaning in the silence. And yet, when he turned back toward the living room minutes later, the cupboard was open again. Then, came the footsteps. At first, just a faint rhythm, soft, deliberate thuds, coming from the upstairs hallway. He froze in place, staring at the ceiling above him. His mind raced, the house is empty, there shouldn't be anyone up there. He waited, holding his breath, straining his ears. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. He tried to brush it off as the old unsettling, the kind of explanation that makes sense when you're desperate for one. But then, the sound returned, heavier this time, a distinct series of steps moving from one end of the hallway to the other. Gathering his nerve, he grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and slowly climbed the staircase. Each step groaned under his weight, and the higher he went, the colder the air felt, as though the upstairs had been left without heat for days. He reached the hallway, shining the flashlight across the carpet. Nothing. The doors to the bedrooms remained shut, the shadows stretching unnaturally long against the walls. He stood there in silence, waiting for movement, waiting for the sound again. Nothing came. Just the stillness pressing in around him. Finally, he turned back toward the stairs, and his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a new text message. No name, just a number he didn't recognize. The message contained only 5 words, "Why are you still here?" His hands shook as he reread it. A prank, he thought. Someone messing with him. But how would they know he was alone? And why now, in the middle of the night? Another message followed. This one said, "Don't look behind you." Slowly, with dread building in his chest, he turned. The hallway was empty. The flashlight beam quivered slightly in his grip. Nothing moved, no one was there. But he could not shake the feeling that someone had been watching him from the shadows. He retreated back downstairs, trying to convince himself he was imagining connections between random events. Maybe he had misplaced his keys. Maybe the cupboard hadn't closed properly. Maybe the footsteps were just the house itself shifting in the night. But the text message? That could not be dismissed so easily. Now the silence was heavier than ever, pressing down on him. Even the smallest noises, the tick of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, felt amplified, intrusive, as if the house itself were listening. He sat back down, staring at his phone, waiting for another message. None came. But just as he began to think the worst had passed, something else happened. From the kitchen came the unmistakable sound of a chair sliding slowly across the tile floor. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving him frozen, flashlight gripped tightly in his hand. He wanted to check, but fear rooted him to the spot. He could picture it perfectly, the chair shifting across the room as though someone unseen had dragged it into place. The silence stretched on. His breathing quickened. And then, from somewhere above him, came a faint, deliberate knock. Just 3 slow taps. The 3 knocks overhead left him paralyzed in his chair, the beam of his flashlight trembling across the living room wall. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might drown out everything else. He forced himself to breathe, shallow and uneven, trying not to make a sound. For a moment, nothing followed. The house returned to silence. But when he finally gathered the courage to move, he noticed something he had not before. The curtains in the living room, the ones he always kept shut tight at night, were slightly open. Just an inch, no more. He was certain he had drawn them closed earlier. And in that narrow gap, he saw what looked like the faintest shimmer of movement outside. He crept toward the window, each step slow, careful, his hands slick with sweat around the flashlight. Pulling the curtain back wider, he froze. The lock on the window was broken. The glass pane stood open just enough for someone to slip a hand through. And there, on the wooden sill, were faint smudges, streaks of mud pressed into the frame. The air inside his lungs seemed to vanish. Someone had been inside. Or worse, was still inside. He staggered back from the window, the room tilting slightly as the realization sank in. His mouth was dry, his hands shaking so badly that the light wavered across the walls. He tried to swallow, but it felt like his throat had closed. Then, the whispering began. At first, it was so faint, he thought it was the wind carrying a sound from outside. But no, the voice was inside the house. A low, breathy murmur, too close, too sharp to be anything but human. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was clear, someone was speaking deliberately, slowly, as if only a few feet away. His legs locked in place. He didn't dare turn toward the sound. The whispering moved, drifting from the kitchen, through the hallway, and into the stairwell. It rose and fell like a hushed conversation. But there was no one else there. Desperate, he reached for his phone and opened the camera. If he could record this, if he could capture something, it would prove he wasn't losing his mind. He held the phone steady, pointing it toward the darkened kitchen, the screen glowing faintly in his hand. At first, the camera showed nothing. Just the outline of chairs, the table, and the faint shine of the refrigerator door. He stood there, staring, waiting. And then it happened. The chair that had scraped across the floor earlier, moved again. Not quickly, not violently. Just a slow, deliberate shift, dragging across the tiles in full view of the camera. His breath caught in his chest. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The chair stopped, angled slightly toward him, as if acknowledging his presence. He backed away, the phone still raised, recording. His whole body trembled, his knees threatening to give out. The whispering returned. This time, clearer, closer. The voice seemed to be right at his ear, though there was no one there. It spoke a single word, drawn out and chilling: stay. The phone slipped in his grip, the camera shaking as the screen flickered with static for a split second before clearing again. When he steadied it, his stomach dropped. On the screen, in the darkened hallway behind him, was a shadow. Human-shaped. Still. Watching. He spun around in an instant, nothing. The hallway was empty. But on the screen, the figure had been there. And worse, it had been moving closer. At that moment, the reality set in. This was no longer about imagination, no longer about the house itself making noises. There was something, someone, in the house with him. Something he couldn't see with his eyes, but that his camera had caught. His pulse thundered in his ears. He could feel every beat in his chest, in his throat, in his fingertips. His breathing came quick, shallow. The dryness in his mouth made it hard to swallow. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body felt locked in place, frozen between fear and disbelief. The living room seemed to close in around him, the shadows stretching farther across the walls, the silence between the whispering heavier than ever. And then the text message came again. His phone buzzed in his trembling hand. This time, the message read, "Don't try to leave." Daniel stood frozen, the glow of his phone lighting his face, the message burned into his eyes, "Don't try to leave." For several long seconds, he couldn't breathe. His body felt like stone, his chest heavy as if something pressed down on it. The silence in the house deepened, thick, waiting. And then, movement. From the end of the hallway, where the bathroom door stood ajar, came the sound of a slow, deliberate step. One foot pressing against the wooden floor. Then another. Daniel raised his flashlight, the beam cutting across the hallway. For a heartbeat, nothing was there. Just the walls, the floor, the open door. But then the light caught something, a pair of eyes. Not glowing. Not shining. Just, eyes. Human eyes, reflecting the faint beam of his flashlight from deep inside the bathroom's darkness. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They only stared directly back at him. His stomach dropped so violently he thought he might collapse. The air rushed from his lungs, and a sharp chill ran down his spine. His trembling hand tightened around the flashlight. For a brief second, he couldn't move, couldn't think. Then the eyes blinked. And they started to move closer. The bathroom door creaked wider, slow and deliberate, as though whoever, or whatever, stood inside wanted him to hear every sound. The shadow stretched across the floor, reaching into the hallway, inching toward him. Daniel's instincts finally screamed loud enough to break the paralysis. He stumbled backward into the living room, his heart hammering against his ribs. His breath came in ragged gasps, loud enough he was certain it could be heard across the house. And then, the sound of footsteps. Not cautious this time, not slow. Heavy, fast, pounding against the floorboards as the figure surged forward. Daniel dropped his phone in panic. The flashlight beam swung wildly, striking the wall, the ceiling, the floor. He didn't dare look back. He bolted into the kitchen, chest heaving, hands scrambling at the counter. He grabbed the first thing he could find, a kitchen knife, and spun around. The hallway was empty. Silent. But he knew. He knew it wasn't gone. The seconds stretched unbearably. He could hear the refrigerator's faint hum. The drip of the faucet. His own breathing, sharp and uneven. Then, another sound. A long exhale, not his own. It came from just beyond the kitchen doorway. Daniel raised the knife, his knuckles white, sweat dripping down his temple. His eyes burned from not blinking. And then, slowly, a figure stepped into view. It was tall, shoulders broad, its face swallowed in shadow. But the eyes, the same eyes he had seen in the bathroom. They locked onto his with an intensity that made his knees tremble. For a long moment, neither moved. The house seemed to hold its breath with him. Then the figure shifted, one step forward. Daniel lunged sideways, racing past the counter, knife clutched tight. The figure followed immediately, its footsteps thunderous, shaking the floor as it gave chase. Daniel tore through the living room, vaulted into the hallway, and slammed his bedroom door shut behind him. He pressed his back against it, chest heaving, knife raised. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. Nothing. Not even breathing. Then, tap. A single, sharp sound against the door. Like a fingertip pressed against the wood. Then another. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel's whole body shook. His eyes darted around the room. He grabbed his phone from the desk, hands slippery with sweat, and fumbled to unlock it. The screen lit up with a flood of notifications. His chest constricted as he scrolled, message after message from the same unknown number. Every single one contained just one word, watching. The tapping stopped. Silence. He dared to hope, maybe it was over. Maybe it had left. He lowered the knife slightly, his breath coming fast, uneven. And then, he heard it. From inside his room. Not outside the door. Not down the hallway. But from the corner, near his desk. The unmistakable sound of slow, steady breathing. Daniel spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam landed on the corner of the room, and his blood turned cold. There, crouched low, half hidden behind the desk, was the figure. It hadn't been outside at all. It had been inside his room the entire time. Its eyes reflected the light again. Wide. Fixed. Waiting. Daniel staggered back, slamming against the wall, knife clattering from his hand. His throat tightened, his legs gave way, and he slid toward the floor, every nerve in his body screaming in terror. The figure rose slowly from the corner, impossibly tall in the narrow room, its shadow stretching across the walls. For one breathless moment, Daniel thought this was the end. And then, the house fell silent again. The figure stopped moving. Its head tilted, its eyes still locked on his. Daniel didn't remember how long he sat frozen against the wall, staring at the corner where the figure stood. His mind blurred, his breath shallow, every second stretching into eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. No movement. No sound. The corner stood empty. His flashlight beam shook across the desk, the books, the chair. Nothing remained. The silence was unbearable. At last, Daniel's body obeyed him. He crawled forward, grabbed his phone, and dialed the only number he could think of, the police. His voice trembled, his words frantic, but the operator told him to stay calm, stay inside, and officers were on the way. Those next minutes were the longest of his life. Every sound felt amplified, the hum of his lamp, the faint ticking of his clock, the whisper of leaves against the window. He expected at any second for the figure to return. But when the knock finally came at the door, it was the police. 2 officers swept through the house, their flashlights slicing across every wall, every corner. They checked the kitchen, the bathroom, the hallways. They climbed into the attic, searched the backyard, tested the locks on every door and window. And yet, nothing. No footprints. No intruder. No sign that anyone else had been there at all. Daniel tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other. The texts, the shadow, the eyes in the bathroom. He showed them his phone. The officers scrolled through the dozens of messages, all from the same unknown number. But when they tried calling it back, the number didn't exist. One officer suggested maybe Daniel had been dreaming. Stress, isolation, a trick of the mind. The other warned him to keep his doors locked, but assured him there was no threat. By the time his parents returned late the next evening, the police report was already filed away as unfounded. Yet Daniel knew better. The next day, still shaken, Daniel turned to the one thing that might give him answers, the small security camera his father had installed above the front porch. It wasn't much. Just a basic device pointing at the front door, recording short clips whenever motion was detected. He opened the app, scrolled through the timeline, and froze. At 1:07 a.m., the exact time he remembered hearing the whispering in the kitchen, the camera had recorded a clip. The footage showed a man. Tall. Broad-shouldered. His face partially hidden by a hood. He stood on the porch, staring directly into the camera, unmoving, for nearly 2 full minutes. And then, without ever touching the door, he turned, and walked out of frame. But the footage didn't end. A second later, another figure appeared. This one smaller, crouched low, its face turned upward toward the lens. Its eyes shone unnaturally bright in the black and white recording, locked on the camera as if it knew Daniel would be watching later. The clip cut off abruptly. Daniel's hands shook as he closed the app. He rushed back into his bedroom, desperate to reassure himself that it was over, that the police had been right. But when he reached his desk, he saw something that hadn't been there before. A message. Scratched into the wood, deep enough that the grooves caught the light. 4 words carved neatly, deliberately. "You let me in." Daniel stumbled back, his mouth dry, his legs weak. He had no memory of anyone entering the room after the police search. No one else had been in the house. And yet the message sat there, etched into his desk, undeniable. In the weeks that followed, Daniel never stayed home alone again. His parents eventually moved from the house. But for Daniel, the memory lingered, not just of the figure, or the messages, or even the security footage. What haunted him most was the message carved into his desk. Because it suggested something far worse. That whoever had entered his home that night, hadn't broken in at all. They had been invited. And that left him with a question he could never answer: when had he opened the door? Sometimes, the creepiest things caught while home alone are the ones we never expect to find.